And welcome back for part 3 of how to cover your model with aluminum. So we're in the final stages. I've got everything covered with aluminum at this point, and I just need to go over some of these things with you guys because there are little nuances here and there. So let's get right into it and show you how it's done. The very first thing you're going to want to pick up at your local hardware store or even at Walmart is, again, your can of acetone. You've been using this to clean your blades, your scissors, etc. as you've been applying the foil. But the first thing you're going to want to do is grab this tin and you're going to fold up a paper towel, same ones, those Viva paper towels that I love so much for this. And you're just going to pour a little bit on. Highly recommend that you use some gloves on this. You don't want this all over your hands. It is harmful to the skin, so be careful. If you are feeling overly precautious, you can absolutely do this in a more well-ventilated area. My shop here gets plenty of ventilation, so we're not using a tremendous amount. We're not having a big vat that we're dipping the parts into. You're just applying some to the paper towel and wiping each seam where you've applied the foil, and just on each part. You're trying to remove some of that leftover residue that's still there, but you're not trying to soak it, and that'll lift up the foil, which you obviously don't want to do. After that, you're going to want to grab your trusted, I prefer window cleaner or glass cleaner for this next job. The reason being is that other surface cleaners can not do as good a job of removing all residues. So the whole purpose of glass cleaner is that it doesn't leave a residue. So again, spray it onto your paper towel and then just wipe the whole surface. You want to make sure it's free of dust and potentially any leftover residue that wasn't fully dissolved onto the paper towel. Doesn't have to be perfect, but what you're trying to do is you're trying to minimize the amount of contaminants that will go onto the polishing step. So again, this is grease, this is the glue, this is dirt and debris that could gouge or mar as you're polishing. And so you want to just keep your polishing pad as clean as possible. Your polishing pad is, well, again, this is sort of up to you, but I'm using a polishing wheel that I picked up off of Amazon. I'll leave a link in the description for you guys, and it's also got an arbor that I've got connected to it with my drill. The reason is you want the rotational force, but you want this really nice soft area to it so you're not putting too much pressure and then subsequently gouging the aluminum. Be able to press, remove some of the aluminum, and move on to the next section. The polishing compound I'm using is Dialux, and I'm using the Rouge, and this is officially it's a jeweler's polishing compound, but it works extremely well for this application. You don't need a whole lot. You spin up the drill and you hold it onto your little brick here, and it puts a little bit of rubbing compound onto the buffing pad. Now, as you go through this, you're going to have some of this fling off. My undershirt is already a bit red from doing some testment, so you're going to get this on you, and it does not wash out. Okay, so make sure you're ready to take a shower when you're done, and you have clothes that you absolutely do not care if you get this stuff on. Definitely a good tip there. So the way you're going to go about this is very methodically. I've already done the acetone wipe down and I've done the Windex wipe down, so I can just move right into this, and I'm going to put in some time-lapse stuff here. But really it's just making sure that you follow the grain to get the best surface finish without much work. Check your work as you go back. There's going to be some residue from the polishing compound. It's okay to go back over. One of the critical things that you're going to find is that there's a buildup of aluminum on the polishing wheel, and that's kind of the point. You're rubbing off a little bit of that aluminum to reveal a perfectly smooth finish. Now the way you can remove that from the wheel as you go is have a piece of aluminum or steel or something close by, and make sure that it has a pretty blunt edge. And you're just going to rub that on the very edge of it, and it'll knock off most of that aluminum off of the polishing pad. Apply your compound again, and then go to work again. Rinse, repeat, and continue. One last note that I need to make as well is that you need to be really careful when you are polishing plastic parts. The whole process obviously is done through friction, okay? So this is going to generate some heat. So on plastic parts, make sure you're doing this slowly and carefully so that you don't melt the plastic. I mean, a little bit of heat is to be expected, but you don't want these parts to distort, and any parts like my canopy, I've got that completely taped off with masking tape so that I'm not rubbing a hole in it in the parts that aren't covered in the foil. Again, try to do the best you can to follow the grain of the foil on those parts, because that'll produce the least amount of work. And again, that's just sort of the light contrast thing that you guys can play with as you apply the foil. And again, think ahead on how you want your model to look. So before we move on any further, I have to let you guys know there are a couple of safety precautions with that polish step. The main thing you want to think about is that this is a very, very, very fine iron oxide particulate. Make sure you use a face mask. You don't want to breathe this stuff in. Make sure you use eye protection. You don't want this stuff flung in your eyes, let alone little micro pieces of aluminum. And I think probably the biggest one is make sure that you have an enclosed space or you're working outside. I thought because of the weight of this stuff it would just settle here in my shop. Not the case. So make sure that you're in a place that can get dirty. I've had to go through and clean this shop stem to stern, and it's still not clean. You can see a little bit of red on my fingers just from doing small things, and that's after I've cleaned. Anyway, so now that your parts are polished, let's go to the next step. The next thing you're going to want to do is take each one of these parts that you've polished, and there's going to be a little leftover residue. You can see on this part, and I'm handling it with, dirty fingers anyway, but there's some pretty pronounced residue from the polishing process on here. Some parts are going to be worse than others, but the binder of the polish is greasy. So you're going to want to get a pretty heavy, like a kitchen degreaser. Mean Green comes to mind. Anything citrus based would do great. I'm personally using a Lysol kitchen cleaner. It works. Glass cleaner is not going to cut it. It's not going to go through and cut the grease down and dissolve that. And that's really what you're trying to do. So again, you're going to want to use your Viva paper towels and make sure that you're going over softly. You don't want to, really go down. If you do have to sort of wipe some of these smudgies around, you want to make sure that it's very well lubricated with the cleaning solution so that you're not scratching using the cloth. I'm going to demonstrate that, so let me get some gloves on. So I just wipe it, and you can see it come off. Again, some of these areas are a little more stuck on than others, but you have enough on your cloth. A little bit of circular motion, not too much pressure, and it eventually comes off just fine. Again, it gets too dirty or saturated, use another spot of the paper towel. You don't want to be rubbing in the compound and creating circular scratches on a micro level. It'd be kind of difficult to see from far away, but up close it'll be much more prevalent. New paper towel. Rinse and repeat on other parts, but just to demonstrate. Nope, wrong bottle. So again, there's a little bit on my glove. That's okay. We're going to go over this part again. Make sure we've got all the residual red off. What you're looking for is very little red going off the part onto the paper towel. Hopefully you're getting all of it. Just a little bit. Yeah, not much. And back to this part. Yeah. You can really see the shine come through once you get all the compound off. Now these are a little bit smudgy. You can see the streaks left behind by the cleaner. And then you can go back with your glass cleaner and get rid of those. And this is going to be important for applying paint in any areas that you're going to apply paint. You want to make sure that this film is off because you don't want to paint over top of it and then your paint flake off as a result. There are going to be a couple tricks that I'm going to show you, but this will make it easier, especially for applying your masks too, so make sure they stick as well. So again, just a little bit of red coming off. Alright, so that's the cleanup stage. Make sure you do it to all of your parts and make sure you do it thoroughly and inspect everything. Again, sometimes as you see things dry, you might see some additional streaks, like here on this panel. So we're going to find a nice clean spot, a little more window cleaner. See, a little more. I think that's from my glove, but yeah, you want to get rid of all of those streaks as much as you can. Okay? Let's move on to the next technique. Now that our surfaces are clean, we can move on to any sort of paint work that we're going to do. So I am using vinyl. It's vinyl from Cali Graphics. She does phenomenal work. And this whole kit was purchased from her. She has the color scheme for Silver Lady, which is the scheme I'm using, and I specifically requested for her to cut out masks for me, so no special color or anything like that, just whatever she had lying around would do. So first things first, we're gonna lay down the vinyl and we're gonna position it per the scale locations approximately, and so I'm going to show you one or two of those and then we'll move on to paint. So here on the wing we have a pretty basic paint application that we're going to do. It's just a simple star and bars, and it's pretty straightforward. So the vinyl comes with a vinyl on a backing, and then there is this thing called like a frisket paper. Is what a lot of people call it. That's what I call it anyway. Anyway, it's like a masking tape kind of material. So what you do is you peel off the back, you position it, and you smooth it all down, and then you peel off the backing to reveal where you are going to paint. Alright? So I'm going to do this as best I can, given the camera angle. So putting this down is very similar to what you're going to do with laying down your foil. The advantage you have this time is that the vinyl is going to stretch a whole heck of a lot more, and you don't have to worry so much about it getting wrinkly or whatever. So pretty close is good enough. And then doesn't have to be down perfectly. What it really needs to be is perfect around the edges where you're going to paint, and I like to press those down with my finger. And this is sticky, and again, you don't want to pull too hard because you're dealing with your aluminum underneath, so just go slow. it seems a little bit off because of this panel line here, but that is at a diagonal, so it's pretty where it needs to be. And again, the leading edge is sweeping forward just a little bit because of the elliptical shape, so you don't want it perfectly even with that, because then it'll look too turned this way. So I mostly just aligned this edge with this seam, and that's how I positioned it. That's really it. Pretty basic. And there is a little bit of a bubble, so very carefully I'm going to lift up on this vinyl, and again it stretches, so I lifted it and flattened that out. Very good. The other thing you can do with this vinyl, if you feel it necessary, is you can heat it. So use a hair dryer and it'll get pliable and stretchy. And that's actually what I'm going to do when I get done painting and go to peel the mask off. That way it just makes things a little bit easier. It softens the paint, so you're not going to rip the paint off. So from here what we're going to do is we're going to use some masking paper. So this is just from the paint department at my Home Depot home improvement store, and it's pretty thin stuff. And I'm going to use my masking tape that I use to make all my panel lines, that same cheap masking tape, and we're going to cover this whole thing. And I'll just put a sheet here, and I'll tape it, and then I'll put a sheet here. You want to cover the absolute entire part of the wing. You don't want any paint to get on here. You can try to rub it off with some acetone if you feel risky. I'm not going to risk it, so it's easier for me just to go ahead and wrap this thing like a Christmas present and get it done. So yeah, then you move on to the next part, and the next part, and the next part. Just position each one of your masks as it will sit. Next, you want to make sure that you take on the different parts and make sure that you put them in a safe place. So, safe place being an outside place or a place that has excellent ventilation. And the reason you want to do this is because next you're going to add a primer to it. I use two different types of primers just because they're two different colors. I use a white primer for stuff that's going to have a light background like yellow. Darker primers can allow you to work with like dark blues or greens or things like that. But I find that the white primer, it just tends to help make the colors more vibrant. Now, the reason you want to do the primer in a well-ventilated area is because it has a lot of really harmful vapors, and I really don't want you guys breathing those things in. So spray the primer onto the clean metal, If you have to wipe it again with Windex or degreaser, do it. You want it to be absolutely 100% clean. I even went to the length of blowing the surface off of any dust before I went with primer. So again, you just want to make sure it's absolutely clean. The reason you want to use primer is because it has ingredients that make it self-etching. Make sure it says something like it's good for metal or it's specifically for aluminum. I really haven't had much problem with one over the other in that regard. Just because this isn't really a highly abusive situation. You're not trying to coat or paint a car part or anything that's going to see any extreme temperatures or anything like that. So that's what I'm using, just bare bones basic primer. The gray primer is an automotive high build primer that I always use in all my projects, so there you go for that. The other paints you're going to use is, I use interior house latex paints. I love them because I can get them mixed up in custom colors. This is actually the navy blue that I have custom mixed up for the roundels. The other paint that I'm using is acrylic paints. And the reason that I use these two different paints is because they're readily available and they're pretty cheap. the thing that I use to apply them is my little airbrush, and this airbrush can be a little bit finicky, and you know, it's a little bit beyond the scope of what I'm going to teach you here today, but I mean, we're just laying down flat colors. This isn't really any great mystery of the universe. One light pass, dry it with the hair dryer, another pass, hair dryer, another pass, hair dryer. Take a good look at it under different angles of light, see if you need another coat, apply another coat, hair dryer, done. It's really not that difficult, and you don't have to worry too much about your feet or your pressure or things like that. We're just applying base colors here. Again, nothing too fancy. So with the airbrush, the paints, before you put it in the cup, I dilute mine at least 50%. So again, 50-50. Depends on how you want to say it. But yeah, definitely dilute your paint. And I'm diluting with window cleaner. Do not try to dilute with acetone or mineral spirits or paint thinner or anything like that. It will separate out the acrylic and the latex, and it'll just be a whole mess, and you'll clog your airbrush, and you'll curse me, and you'll think I'm an evil person when I'm not. I told you, don't do that. So from there, it's just put the paint in the cup and spray it and go to town. So use a respirator, use a respirator, use a respirator. So now I'm going to show you how I go about my riveting technique, and it's pretty universal across my models. It's not really anything too difficult. It is time consuming just because there are literally thousands of these things to do. I prefer to do these by hand. Other people prefer to do the application using a ruler and a wheel tool that I just don't use, because even at 1/7 scale, given a rivet diameter of 1 inch, that scales down to about 3.5 millimeters. And it's too small. It looks like pin pricks, like they're holes in the surface. So I prefer to do this way just because it looks better. And anyway, the tools that I use to make the rivets, the first tool is this little, it's essentially a syringe tip, but it's not sharp on the end. It's cut. It's used in the scientific industry, but you can get small tubes through various suppliers. McMaster Carr is a suggestion. But the inner diameter of this tube is 0.7 millimeters, and it has an overall diameter of around 0.9 millimeters. After you create the impression, the overall rivet diameter is about 1 millimeter. So given that it's a little bit smaller than scale, it doesn't make the model look quite as bulky. So that's something else to consider when you're considering your rivet sizes. The other thing that I'm using is obviously a ruler. I also have the other sewing vinyl tape that I use so that I'm not scratching the surface, but I mostly use this to measure my reference printouts so that I know exactly where I need to place my rivet lines. The other thing I'm using is this marker. It's a water-based ink, but it has this tip that is very, very soft. It's for doing watercolors. It's a watercolor marker, and link in the description. I'll put that in there. You can get these on Amazon. It's like a pack of several for like 10 bucks. And it's really nice because any other marker, like a fine tip Sharpie, it's going to leave a score or indentation into the aluminum, and this will not, and it's easily wiped up with like glass cleaner. The other thing that I'm using is a guide. Now, this was given to me by another club member. It's just a piece of vinyl tape that has perforations at the scale 1/7 spacing, and you can pick these up at various places. It's not entirely critical that you have the spacing right. I'm just doing it because given the shiny surface on this, it's going to look a lot better. But as long as you're consistent in your spacing, it's going to look fine. And with that, you know, I can just show you I can show you a time-lapse video of this, and while that's all great and good, and it's amazing how long it takes, really what you need to know is the proper technique, because it's not just about punching into the surface, and we're going to get into that next. So let's do it. Alright guys, so I'm zoomed in here. And I'm just going to show you the basic technique that you're going to do over and over and over again. You can see I've got the vinyl. It's got an adhesive on it, but you can tape the guide into position using masking tape. But each one of these locations you're going to put a little mark. And just to show you, it's not just a matter of putting it in position and doing a little press. And to show you what that looks like, while that's okay, really what you're after is something that's a little more pronounced. It's a happy balance, because keep in mind how small this is. You can puncture through pretty easily. So again, practice, practice, practice. But what you're going to do is you're going to place it, push down a little bit, and rotate. And do that over and over and over again. And what you're left with is something that is far more pronounced. What I'll do to demonstrate this, you saw those, we'll just do little pokes. There's 4 more. And you can see how they're not nearly as pronounced compared to the first 4. And so the reason you have to do this is because you're coming in at this angle or this angle or this angle. You want it to be flush around at all different angles. So again, going back over these, just a little wiggle, and it's much more pronounced. So you can see that the lip that builds up on the outside extends beyond just the perimeter of the tool that you're using. And again, I'm using another tool up here for these. It's a little piece of aluminum tube for these larger fasteners, and it's the same idea. Press and rotate. So that's really all you need to do, and just be patient. This process can take as long as you want to, depending on how careful you're going to be. But on average for a model, for me, it's somewhere between 10 and 12 hours. Alright, so the very last thing that I'm going to show you guys here on this finishing process is what I do to help kind of prevent fingerprints. So obviously you're going to be handling the model a lot through the riveting process, so it's important that you go through and you clean again everything. For the most part, the glass cleaner will take off anything. If you have some really oily hands, obviously you can use any sort of kitchen degreaser just to make your life a little bit easier. Be mindful though that again you're going over with something that could potentially scratch the surface. So going back to our favorite Viva paper towels, as I've mentioned previously, I'm using a product that I discovered years ago. It's called Sheila Shine, and Sheila Shine is just an overall metal polish, proven stainless steel polish and surface preservative, but we're not using stainless, we're using aluminum. Works just the same. Leaves a little bit of an oily residue, makes things a little bit slippery, but it's kind of worth it, and I'll show you what I mean. So really what you do is you just spray a little bit on the cloth. You don't need a whole lot, and you simply wipe down the surface. And if you apply too much, when it sort of dries out, it does leave a little bit of a film, so you wipe it down, and then using the dry portion of the cloth, wipe up any excess. And it leaves a nice, even shine. Move this around, so you can kind of see. So here's comparing the two. You might be able to see a little bit of a difference, but really what the difference is when you get into handling it again. So I've just washed my hands pretty recently, and I'm already leaving thumbprints all over this. And then on this one, when I handle it, the thumbprints are there, but they're not easily as noticeable. And you can also come back with like a microfiber cloth that you keep on hand, and it'll easily wipe those away. It won't be nearly as much work. So keep that on there. Again, it doesn't have to be a whole lot. This can will easily last you the life of the whole model, but absolutely worth it to get a nice even look, especially because these models are going to be sitting in the sun, and thumbprints and, you know, overall little water spots, you know, drip a little bit of sweat. Those things are going to show up really, really well in the hot sun. But that's it. That's really all you need to know. That's at least all that I can offer for you to know about this. Absolutely leave comments of your tips and suggestions for this same process. I love sharing all of these techniques with you guys, and I hope that you can absolutely use them to your advantage. Work with them on your own. Figure out what works with you, what doesn't work with you, and absolutely make yourself your own flying work of art.